There's a mountain range along the Iran-Iraq border right now where men and women who grew up hunted by their own government are picking up rifles again, and this time they're not doing it alone. 5 different political parties that have spent decades fighting each other for influence just put their flags on the same table and said one thing together. It's time to bring this regime down. It's August 16th, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're doing great wherever you're tuning in from today. Here's what we're covering. A coalition of Iranian Kurdish parties that hasn't existed in this form in the modern history of the Islamic Republic. Clashes breaking out across 3 provinces in western Iran. IRGC ambushes, Peshmerga fighters getting killed and killing back, drone strikes hitting refugee camps in Iraq, and a question that Tehran does not want anyone asking out loud right now. What happens if the Kurds actually pull this off? So stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the mullahs in Tehran are more nervous about the mountains in the west than they are about anything happening in the Gulf right now. So let's set the stage, because this didn't happen overnight. Iran's Kurdish population sits mostly in the west of the country. Provinces like Kurdistan, Kermanshah, and West Azerbaijan, right along the border with Iraq. These are not new grievances. These are decades of executions, decades of being treated as second-class citizens inside their own country, decades of Tehran calling any Kurdish political activity terrorism, while simultaneously refusing to let Kurds have any real political voice. And through all of that, several different armed and political groups have existed, sometimes fighting the regime, sometimes fighting each other, rarely working together. That's the part that just changed, and it changed in a big way. On February 22nd of this year, 5 major Iranian Kurdish parties stood up together at a press conference and announced something that hadn't happened before. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Khabat organization, and a branch of the Komala Party of Iranian Kurdistan formed a united coalition against the Tehran regime. Think about that for a second. These are groups with different ideologies, different histories, some more nationalist, some more socialist, some with roots going back to the 1940s, all agreeing that whatever separated them before doesn't matter anymore compared to the goal of ending this regime. 2 other branches of the Komala Party didn't join, so it's not perfectly unified, but 5 out of 7 major factions under one banner is still the biggest consolidation of Iranian Kurdish power in generations. They call themselves the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, or CPFIK if you want the acronym. And their stated goal isn't subtle at all. They openly describe their aim as toppling the Iranian regime and achieving Kurdish self-determination inside Iranian Kurdistan. No hiding it, no diplomatic language, just straight-up regime change and autonomy. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this coalition didn't form in a vacuum. It formed right in the middle of the biggest protest wave Iran has seen in years. And then almost immediately after that, it formed right into the middle of an actual shooting war. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated military operation against Iran, operations that people are now calling Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, and they went after the regime's nuclear infrastructure and its military command. So you had a brand new Kurdish political coalition standing up literally days before American and Israeli airstrikes started dismantling the regime that coalition was trying to topple. That's not a coincidence, and honestly, it's not supposed to look like one either. According to reporting from Axios, U.S. and Israeli officials confirmed that the idea of supporting Iranian Kurdish factions as a potential ground force for an offensive out of Iraq into Iran originated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Mossad, with the CIA joining the effort not long after. So this wasn't some grassroots uprising that caught everyone by surprise. This was, at least in part, a deliberate strategic bet by 2 of the most capable intelligence services on the planet that arming and organizing the Kurds could open up a second front against Tehran from the inside. And President Trump didn't exactly play coy about it either. When he was asked directly about the prospect of a Kurdish offensive into Iran, he said, "I'd be all for it." 4 words, but 4 words that told you everything about where Washington's head was at during those opening days of the war. Reports were swirling that the United States and Israel were arming this ethnic minority group specifically to put more pressure on a regime that was already getting hammered from the air. Now, is that the full picture? Not exactly, because official U.S. objectives in that war were never premised on standing up or arming a local ground force the way, say, the Syrian Democratic Forces were armed against ISIS. But the appetite was clearly there, at least among the people making calls to Kurdish leaders in those first few days of the conflict. So while airstrikes were falling on Tehran, something else was happening in the mountains. Iranian Kurdish opposition groups created what analysts are now calling a new front through the CPFIK, designed to stretch Iranian security forces thin and control key border areas and strategic corridors. Picture it like this. Every soldier, every IRGC unit, every drone that Tehran has to keep pointed west toward the Kurdish mountains is a soldier, a unit, and a drone that isn't available somewhere else. That's the whole strategic logic here. You don't need the Kurds to march into Tehran and plant a flag. You just need them to be enough of a threat that the regime has to bleed resources defending its own western border, while everything else is falling apart. And Iran knew exactly what this meant, which is why the response was brutal almost immediately. During the war, Iran turned its attention toward these Kurdish opposition groups that are based just across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan. Iran carried out hundreds of drone and missile strikes on exiled Iranian Kurdish militant groups inside Iraq, killing at least 10 of their members during that stretch alone. Think about the message in that. While the regime is getting its own military infrastructure vaporized by American and Israeli strikes, it's still finding the resources to launch precision strikes on Kurdish camps hundreds of kilometers away in another country. That tells you how seriously Tehran takes this threat. This isn't an afterthought for them. This might be one of their top 3 fears. Let's talk about who's actually doing the fighting here, because these aren't some ragtag group of protesters with sticks. Some of these organizations have real military infrastructure and real combat experience. Start with the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PJAK. Founded in 1991, PJAK fought alongside Iraqi Kurdish forces against ISIS and reportedly attacked Iranian security forces during the early 2026 anti-government protests. These are people who have actually stood on a battlefield against one of the most brutal terrorist organizations in modern history. That's not a resume you build overnight. Then there's PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, and this one's a bit more complicated because of who they're connected to. The U. Hess Treasury Department designated PJAK a specially designated global terrorist back in 2009 for being an offshoot of the PKK. And PJAK reportedly accounts for something like 70% of all Kurdish attacks against the Iranian regime since 2014. Let that number sink in for a second. 7 out of every 10 Kurdish attacks on Iran over the last decade or so, one single group. That tells you where the actual muscle in this movement has historically come from. Their armed wing is called the Eastern Kurdistan Units, or YRK. According to analysts at the Atlantic Council, the YRK is assessed to be fielding some of the most capable fighters in this entire coalition, and a significant number of them are women. That's not a small detail either. If you followed Kurdish fighting forces at all over the last decade, you know that female fighters have consistently been some of the most disciplined and effective units on any Kurdish battlefield, going all the way back to the fight against ISIS. Then you've got the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, PDKI, formed all the way back in 1945. The socialist-oriented PDKI has helped lead past insurgencies inside Iran and reportedly carried out its own operations amid the recent unrest. This is the grandfather of Iranian Kurdish resistance groups. They've been at this fight in one form or another since before the Islamic Republic even existed. Round out the coalition with Khabat, formed in 1980, and Komala of the Toilers of Kurdistan, and you've got 5 separate organizations, 5 separate histories, 5 separate ideologies, now nominally pointed in the same direction for the first time in a very long time. Now here's the thing about coalitions like this. Everybody loves to talk about the guns and the fighters, but the real story is what happens on the ground politically, because that's actually where this coalition has been doing some of its sharpest work. On March 2nd, in their very first joint statement since the coalition was founded, the CPFIK addressed Iran's own armed forces, stationed in Kurdish areas directly, and urged them to separate themselves from what they called the remnants of the Islamic Republic. That's not a battlefield tactic, that's psychological warfare, and analysts described it exactly that way. Think about what that statement is actually trying to do. It's trying to get Iranian soldiers, some of whom are themselves ethnic Kurds, serving in units stationed in their own home provinces, to look around and ask themselves who they're actually fighting for. The coalition also called on the local population to remain vigilant, to coordinate their political actions with the alliance's guidance, and to protect public institutions and service facilities during what they explicitly described as a period of potential regime collapse and popular uprising. They weren't hedging their language. They were telling their own people to get ready for the regime to fall and to be prepared to hold the infrastructure when it did. A few days later, PJAK went even further and called on the people of Iranian Kurdistan to form what they called local governance committees and self-defense committees. The idea was to resist displacement by government forces and to stay away from areas known to be regime strongholds. This is essentially a blueprint for a parallel government structure, built quietly in the mountains and the towns of western Iran, while the regime is distracted, fighting a war on multiple fronts. And Tehran noticed. Of course Tehran noticed. In response, the Iranian government started reviving something called the Muslim Peshmerga, a pro-regime Kurdish militia designed specifically to counter the CPFIK and to fight fellow Kurds on behalf of the Islamic Republic. Statements coming out of that group were mourning the death of Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the US. Israeli strikes and threatening the United States, Israel, and the Kurdish opposition all in the same breath. So now you've got Kurds fighting Kurds inside a bigger war, which is exactly the kind of ugly complexity that makes this conflict so hard to predict. Let's talk casualties for a second, because the numbers tell a story that headlines alone don't capture. Wikipedia's running tally on the broader crisis puts it at roughly 10 CPFIK-aligned fighters killed and a number injured from Iranian aerial attacks during the war itself, plus additional losses from the protest period before that. Iran's own strikes into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is technically a different country, hit hard too. At least 60 people were killed and around 100 wounded just from strikes tied to that campaign, along with Peshmerga forces, Asayish security personnel, and members of the opposition groups themselves. Around 200 separate attacks on the Kurdistan region alone were recorded within the first 2 weeks of March. That is an absolutely relentless pace of strikes against people who, again, are technically not even fighting inside Iran when they get hit. They're getting hit while they're sitting in camps across the border in a sovereign neighboring country. Imagine the outrage if any other country's military was launching 200 strikes in 2 weeks against political dissidents living abroad. But this is standard operating procedure for Tehran. Now let's fast forward, because the ceasefire came, and you would think that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. On June 17th, Iran and the United States signed a memorandum of understanding to end hostilities in the broader war. The bombs stopped falling on Tehran's nuclear sites. The headlines about the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran started to fade, and most casual observers probably assumed that meant the Kurdish situation cooled off too. It didn't. If anything, it got worse because now the regime had a little bit of breathing room to turn its attention fully toward crushing what it saw as an internal threat before it could grow into something bigger. By late June, the mountains were active again. Clashes broke out between PJAK and the IRGC in the highlands near Marivan and in the areas south of Mahabad. By the end of June and into early July, the fighting spread to the border with Iraq, to the Sardasht, Baneh, and Safkez Triangle, and it started pulling in other groups, including the PDKI. PJAK's own explanation for this was pretty blunt. They stated that the renewed clashes were a direct consequence of the memorandum between the U.S. and Iran, arguing that once the pressure on Tehran from Washington eased off, it was Iran that escalated the situation against the Kurds specifically. In other words, the second Tehran didn't have to worry about American bombs anymore. It turned its full attention back to its own backyard. And it got personal fast. 2 prominent Yarsani Kurdish cultural activists were killed, which sparked outrage across the region. A PJAK spokesperson responded with a line that pretty much sums up the entire mentality of this conflict, saying that when the regime speaks to the Kurdish people through executions, assassinations, and massacres, the Kurds will answer with legitimate self-defense. That's not the language of a group looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. That's the language of a group that has decided this is existential now. Let's walk through what actually happened on the ground, because the last few weeks have been intense. On the evening of June 29th, 2 members of the IRGC were shot outside their own homes in the city of Pave in Kermanshah province, a predominantly Kurdish region. The very next day, June 30th, 6 IRGC members were killed in a separate clash, and PJAK's armed wing, the YRK, engaged in sporadic fighting across Baneh, Pave, and Mahabad. That's 3 different towns, hundreds of kilometers apart in some cases, all lighting up with violence within roughly 48 hours of each other. That's not one isolated incident, that's a coordinated pattern. Then, on July 1st, one of the deadliest single incidents of this entire renewed conflict happened. IRGC forces from what's called the Hamza Saeed al-Shuhada base ambushed a vehicle carrying PDKI fighters near the village of Keskapan, close to Piranshah. 6 PDKI fighters were killed in that ambush. Different reporting put the number at 5, with Iran's own state media confirming they'd killed 5 members of the band PDKI in that operation, while the group itself told journalists that 6 of their Peshmerga were killed. Either way you slice it, that single ambush, combined with other clashes that same week, pushed the total number of Kurdish opposition fighters killed in that period to around 10. And when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the Kurdish region has now been hit by more than 850 separate attacks since this all kicked off back in February, leaving at least 6 civilians dead and dozens more wounded, according to Kurdish human rights monitors. Now, here's a detail that I think gets lost in a lot of the coverage. This isn't a one-sided massacre where Kurdish fighters just show up to get killed. They're inflicting real casualties, too. Iraq's Shafaq News reported that 4 Iranian security personnel were killed and several others wounded in 2 separate armed attacks across western and northwestern Iran in a single day. Iran's own IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency confirmed that 2 of its members were killed and 2 more wounded in what it called an armed terrorist attack in Pave. There was also a shooting at a police checkpoint in Baneh, where gunmen killed 2 police officers and wounded 3 other people, including, tragically, a 3-year-old girl caught in the crossfire. And Rojalat Media, which tracks the region closely, reported that at least 3 more government security personnel were killed in a separate attack in the Doli Mirawa area of Pave, following clashes in both Marivan and Mahabad, where IRGC members had already taken casualties. You even had a brand new armed group show up out of nowhere claiming responsibility for one of these attacks, calling themselves Zori Hiwa, which translates roughly to Son of Hope. Analysts who watch this region closely say that when a new name like this suddenly appears, it's usually not an actual brand new organization forming from scratch. It's typically just a rebranded cell of an existing group, operating under a different name for operational security or messaging reasons. But whether it's a genuinely new player or just a new label on an old fighter, the fact that new groups are popping up at all tells you the appetite for armed resistance in these provinces is spreading, not shrinking. By the time you get to mid-July, the situation had escalated into something that looks a lot less like scattered unrest and a lot more like an actual insurgency. On July 19th, an Iranian drone strike killed a PJAK fighter inside Iraqi Kurdistan, and PJAK responded with retaliatory attacks in Iran's Bani and Sardisht regions. Analysts covering the region pointed out something important here. This effectively signaled a breakdown of the 2011 ceasefire between PJAK and the Iranian government, a ceasefire that had held, at least loosely, for over a decade. PJAK made its position crystal clear too, stating publicly that it will not disarm or dissolve the way the PKK has been doing as part of its peace process with Turkey, and that it will respond militarily anytime it's provoked. That's a group positioning itself for a long fight, not a quick symbolic uprising. And then just weeks before this video, on the night of July 1st, 5 members of the KDPI were killed in an armed clash with the IRGC near that same village of Kaskapan close to Kermanshah, and the KDPI reported that one of its camps in Iraqi Kurdistan had been hit by drones that same evening. So you've got clashes happening on Iranian soil and drone strikes happening across the border in Iraq, sometimes on the very same day. That's the level of intensity we're talking about right now. Let's do a quick tour through the actual geography of where this fight is playing out, because these aren't random dots on a map. Kermanshah, right on the border in West Azerbaijan province, has become one of the deadliest flashpoints, the site of multiple ambushes involving both PDKI and general Kurdish opposition forces. Mahabad, roughly 230 kilometers north of Marivan, has repeatedly seen IRGC operations, including one where the Hamze Saeed al-Shuhada base claimed it had neutralized a 6-member opposition team in the highlands between Mahabad and Kermanshah, using heavy artillery support. Marivan itself has been a recurring flashpoint for PJAK and YRK engagements since early June. Pava, about 100 kilometers south of Marivan in Kermanshah province, has seen everything from targeted shootings of IRGC members to full checkpoint attacks. Bani, sitting geographically between Marivan and Mahabad, has hosted both PJAK clashes and that tragic police checkpoint shooting. And in Sardasht, along with Sakez, rounds out what analysts are now calling a triangle of sustained fighting. As Rojalat Media put it, with clashes hitting West Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, and Kermanshah provinces all within the same week, that's pointing to a significant escalation in military confrontations spreading right across the region, not staying contained to one hotspot. So let's step back and ask the real question here, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating from a strategic standpoint. Is this actually a renewed Kurdish insurgency, or is it just a temporary spike in violence that fizzles out once both sides get tired? The honest answer is that serious experts are split, and for good reason. Analysts writing for foreign policy have pushed back hard against the skeptics, arguing that critics who dismiss Iranian Kurdish involvement are overstating the risks and miscalculating what's actually happening on the ground. Their argument is that these Kurdish groups aren't foolishly running into a fight without any strategic value. They're deliberately creating a new front that stretches Iranian security forces thin and forces Tehran to divide its attention and its resources at exactly the moment it can least afford to. On the other side, you've got voices like Henri Barkey at the Council on Foreign Relations pointing out that while Iran's Kurdish leaders are clearly mobilizing in the aftermath of the US-Israeli strikes, their actual ability to mount a successful armed resistance capable of genuinely threatening the regime remains, in his words, highly doubtful. And there's a very real historical reason for that skepticism. Kurdish groups have been burned by outside powers before, more than once, and there's a legitimate fear running through parts of this coalition that arming and provoking a full uprising, only to have international tension and support evaporate the moment the broader war ends, would leave them exposed to exactly the kind of brutal crackdown Tehran is already carrying out. That's part of why, even at the peak of the war back in the spring, Kurdish groups reportedly stayed relatively passive on the offensive front, despite all the American and Israeli encouragement. Reports of leaked defensive plans, concerns about long-term arming commitments, and significant pressure from Turkey, which is deeply uncomfortable watching any Kurdish military buildup near its own southeastern border, all combined to close what analysts describe as the window of opportunity for a coordinated large-scale Kurdish offensive during the war itself. But here's the thing that makes the current moment different from that earlier hesitation. This isn't really about a grand offensive anymore. What's happening right now in these weekly ambushes, these checkpoint shootings, these drone strikes and counterstrikes spreading across 3 provinces, looks a lot more like the slow reignition of a long-simmering insurgency than it does a coordinated military campaign. And that distinction actually matters a lot, because insurgencies don't need a green light from Washington or Tel Aviv to keep going. They don't need a formal ceasefire to end. They just need grievances, weapons, and enough people willing to keep fighting. And right now in Iranian Kurdistan, all 3 of those ingredients are present in larger quantities than they've been in over a decade. Think about what Tehran is actually juggling right now. It just came out of a war that saw its supreme leader killed, its nuclear infrastructure hammered, and its military command structure shattered. It's dealing with a naval blockade in the Gulf that's costing it hundreds of millions of dollars a day. It's watching a second American aircraft carrier make its way into the region on top of the one already there. And now, in the middle of all of that, it's fighting a multi-front insurgency in its own western provinces, an insurgency being waged by 5 historically divided political factions that have somehow found enough common ground to coordinate, at least loosely, against a common enemy. That is an enormous amount of pressure for any government to absorb at once, let alone one that just lost its top religious and political authority in an airstrike. And the regime's response tells you everything about how seriously it's taking this. When you're willing to launch 200 strikes into a neighboring sovereign country within 2 weeks just to hit political dissidents, when you're reviving an old pro-regime Kurdish militia specifically to fight other Kurds on your behalf, when you're ambushing vehicles in the mountains and hitting refugee camps across an international border, that's not the behavior of a confident government that thinks this problem is going to solve itself. That's the behavior of a government that is genuinely afraid its western flank could unravel the same way other fronts have unraveled this year. So where does this actually go from here? If the pattern of the last few months holds, expect this to keep escalating in fits and starts rather than exploding into one dramatic, decisive battle. Expect more ambushes in places like Kermanshah and Pave. Expect more Iranian strikes across the border into Iraqi Kurdistan, which is going to keep putting pressure on the government in Erbil, caught, as it always is, between not wanting to provoke Tehran and not wanting to be seen as abandoning fellow Kurds. Expect PJAK, with its combat experience and its refusal to disarm, to remain the tip of the spear in terms of actual armed engagements, while PDKI and PAK continue building out political infrastructure and local governance structures in the towns and villages where the regime's grip is weakest. And expect Tehran to keep responding with the only tool it really trusts anymore, which is overwhelming, indiscriminate force, the same tool that's been failing to permanently crush Kurdish resistance in Iran for the better part of a century now. Because here's the historical reality that Tehran doesn't like to talk about. This isn't the first time Iranian Kurds have risen up. It's not even close to the first time. There have been waves of Kurdish resistance going back to the earliest days of the Islamic Republic, and every single time, the regime has used brutal force to push the fighting back into the mountains, declared victory and moved on, only to watch it flare up again a few years later. What's different this time is the context. This isn't happening in isolation. It's happening while the regime is simultaneously fighting off the after effects of a devastating war, managing a naval blockade that's strangling its economy, dealing with a population that's already shown it's willing to protest in the streets, and now trying to put down an armed uprising on top of all of it. Every one of those pressures on its own is manageable. All of them at once, hitting a government that just lost its supreme leader, is a completely different equation. Whether this coalition actually manages to hold together long enough to matter is still an open question. Coalitions built out of decades of rivalry have a way of cracking under pressure, especially when outside support becomes uncertain, and there's a real history of Kurdish movements getting promises from powerful allies that quietly evaporate once the strategic winds shift. But right now, in August of 2026, something genuinely unusual is happening in western Iran. 5 parties that used to barely speak to each other are coordinating. Fighters are dying and inflicting real casualties on IRGC forces in return. Local governance committees are quietly being organized in towns the regime thought it controlled. And a supreme leader's own security forces are getting ambushed on roads they used to consider safe. However this ends, it is already one of the most serious internal threats the Islamic Republic has faced in years, and it's happening at the exact moment the regime has the least capacity left to deal with it. What do you think happens next? Does this coalition actually hold together and turn into a real threat to the regime? Or does Tehran manage to crush it the way it's crushed every previous wave of Kurdish resistance, Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this video helped you understand what's actually happening in Western Iran right now, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of reporting reach more people who need to see it. And if you want to stay on top of every twist in this story as it develops, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. And share this with anyone you know who's been following the situation in Iran but hasn't heard about what's happening with the Kurds yet, because this part of the story deserves way more attention than it's getting. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.